I'm Vanessa, and as always, hello to whoever will view the recording later, acknowledging whoever you are. I'm Vanessa, and I'm going to talk to you about how to recreate styles, and in particular an old style. And that's my Twitter handle there for if anyone has questions later and wants to reach me. And also Green Info Network's Twitter handle, because the map I'm going to talk about, the old map that I made, was done while at Green Info Network, and we do lots of other cool stuff if you ever want to see any of it. And before diving in, I also wanted to talk about a talk I gave briefly in 2019. This is already on YouTube, but if you find anything I say useful now, you may find this talk useful because it was about recreating map monsters, and then there are also a bunch of useful design tips about just how to utilize technologies to recreate aesthetics, because that's just what I really like talking about, I guess. I've done it a lot in the past decade. If you've seen me give any talk, I'd probably say aesthetic elements plenty of times, as I will again today, as this overview says. I'm also going to talk about aesthetic research as well as a variety, just like what mapping technologies mean in context to old maps and new maps and styles, and then utilizing all aesthetic elements that you're analyzing to recreate a map style. So this is the map style I'm going to be using as a reference in recreating styles. It was made for OpenHistoricalMap.org, and if you have your laptop, you can go check it out now. It's just on the right side as an option, and it is a woodblock style specifically, but really it just looks like an old map style. And if anyone knows me as well, I love map monsters, and I got to put some in this map, which was really exciting. And again, the talk from 2019 talked about recreating map monsters if you're interested in knowing how to do that. The first step, though, for recreating any style, whether it's an old style, whether you want to recreate Impressionism into a map style, is understanding how to break down the overarching style into aesthetic elements. And first, of course, for those who don't know what that is, the definition is something that's identifiable and a much smaller element that is part of the larger map or visual. I think of them as building blocks, essentially. And for use in maps, the way to contextualize it is kind of initially getting it into general categories like points, lines, and polygons. That's what we're really used to thinking about for maps, of course. And then it's also important for aesthetics in particular to also think about other things you're seeing in the visual, like patterns, typography, color, of course, and also texture, whatever marginalia might exist. If it's an old map, it's probably going to have a lot of marginalia pieces, and just enter any other definable characteristics that you think would help, give that feeling of the old style or whatever style you're trying to recreate. And yeah, what are distinct characteristics within all of those elements? So you're going to take each aesthetic element and break it down even further, which I will, of course, explain. But just to summarize what I just said, some examples of some core map components for aesthetic element pieces. So for polygons, you might be looking at country polygons or lake polygons. For lines in an old map, you might be looking at how the road looks or how the rivers look. And for points, as an example, like a city marker. And other important stuff are polygon fills. I often use patterns for polygon fills, but really it could just be color for that too. And line patterns, which for the woodblock style, there's a very distinct ink line pattern that happens and that I had to recreate. And some visual examples, because I'm a visual person, as I'm sure many here are. The background that I used in the woodblock style ended up being a polygon pattern fill, and it was emulating parchment paper. And the line work, in order to make the lines look like an old map, it was a line pattern. And the other, so miscellaneous non-polygon line or point was symbology. Obviously, we use symbology often as a point representation, but the symbology usually is a complicated thing. So, as you are gathering aesthetic elements, it is important to note you don't need to yet solve how you're going to recreate any of these elements. It's really, you're using this list of things to inspire you to know how you want to pull stuff in, and you'll answer that later and how you recreate it in step 3. So first, like I said, you want to do some research. And the research will be breaking down an aesthetic visual observation from your own perspective. And I just threw up, because I love Halloween, And, well, I'm wearing a skeleton shirt right now, so I made a Tim Burton style once, and I used the same process. So it's not just old maps, it's any style. So I just broke down a Tim Burton aesthetic based off of my own perspective. And you also can look up, if there's any resources available, how other people have defined that style. So if you're doing Impressionism, there's definitely resources out there. They're going to tell you how that style is actually broken down. If it's a particular map style from the history of cartography, there are resources there too in libraries. There's plenty of cartographers in this room who also will be able to send you where you can look that up, including myself. If you do want to recreate an old map style, I'm always happy to nerd out about that. So understanding all of that stuff can really help in knowing what aesthetic elements you want to recreate. And this is just a breakdown of me taking notes on how I want to recreate a style. I think verbal documentation is really important. And of course, that's just choosing a word or reference for yourself for what that description means. While visuals really help, it's important to really think about what the thing is that you're looking at. And I think it just helps to write it out because then you can break it down further. And this is an example from my master's thesis where I defined a bunch of styles in history cartography. So inconsistent _T was defined as similar to irregular, but used specifically only for lines. And it's way more specific than anyone in this room needs to get. But if you're analyzing across 50 maps and doing 1,000 things, it's good to have really detailed descriptions. But you don't need to go that in depth, but just as an example. And like I said, it's good to have visuals as well. So what I like to do in more general terms now is to just screen capture a bunch of visuals that I really liked, and then also add some quick visual descriptions. And this is an example for copper plate maps where I have the aesthetic element name and the visual example. And of course, you can do this in whatever way is important to you. It doesn't need to be screenshots. It can be pages pulled from a magazine. It can be pictures. Whatever works for you, just make it so that it works for your own workflow. And step 2 is very important because you need to determine how you want to recreate this map style. If you're making it in ArcPro or QGIS, if you want open source, or if you really want to make sure to get very specific design details in Adobe Illustrator or Inkscape, or if you want to get that into a vector-based program online, like Mapbox Studio or Matputnik or Fresco, you want to be understanding, of course, what the final thing you're going to be using to display the map, because the reality is, historically and today, mapping and design technologies are always the limiting factor in how we can display maps and how we can make it look a certain way. Of course, we're constantly trying to figure out how to make things look a certain way in Photoshop and Illustrator and HTML and CSS and JavaScript and everything, but so many things will not replicate a very particular brushstroke. So you have to figure out the specific technology you're going to use and see if it's even possible to replicate that visual. So like I said, analysis capabilities are going to be part of your determination of technology, design, as well as performance if it's online, because of course online there's Wi-Fi, limitations in speed, there's probably going to be more size limits, and of course you might be printing this, in which case it kind of matters a lot less in terms of those kind of things. And another thing might just be knowledge limits. So your familiarity with a technology may also be the determining factor. It might also be a reason for you to learn a new technology, but that's always worth considering too. And just as an example, I don't think it's possible to make this really cool Tim Burton water pattern in Esri ArcPro. If it is, please show me, but I don't think it is, and so that might be a lack of knowledge for me, but it also might just be a technical inability. So I did not use ArcPro when I was making this pattern for the Tim Burton style. So after you think about all the technologies that you might be using, which still might just be one, then you finally can decide how you want to recreate the aesthetic elements. And so then you want to just decide which ones make sense for those technologies and how you want to incorporate it into those technologies or single technology. So for the OpenHistoricalMap woodblock style, should be careful to not fall off. The technologies I ended up using was Mapbox Studio to draft the style because I knew it needed to be interactive. It was going to be web-based for OpenHistoricalMap. I also used Adobe Illustrator for pattern making because a bunch of the aesthetic elements I was making were pretty pattern-based. And I used Matputnik for the final edits because we wanted to use an open source software, online software, and GitHub to store and deploy the style and host the patterns that I made. So the aesthetic elements that I chose were parchment paper for the background, a particular font choice, making sure there's a font halo, which I'll explain, and specific types of line work, administrative and roads, and of course symbology. And usually I would say to recreate a style, it's good to choose between 3 and 5. You can obviously always do more, but at a certain point, it's a little obvious in terms of the similar style you're trying to recreate. And it is good to ask others when you're working on it if people can see that it's that particular style. But it's worth noting you don't need to use every single aesthetic element that you researched. You can just incorporate a few. So as I said before, I used parchment paper, a parchment paper pattern. Say that 3 times fast, for the background. And it looked like this, which I don't know if it's showing up really well over there, but go to openhistoricalmap.org to see what it looks like. And shout out to Tim Sinot at Green Info Network, because he actually is who made this particular pattern, and I just love the pattern, so I asked if I could use it, which of course he said yes. And in a lot of 1400s woodblock styles, there's a lot of thick black lettering like this. And I found an open source one called Adui, which also kind of looks like a Lord of the Rings type font if you want to recreate a Lord of the Rings map. So I incorporated that into the style, and on the left you see an example of what it looked like. And another important element for woodblock styles is the way the font is styled in terms of the halo. So halos were either painted, when the map was painted, there was a space left for the label for someone to write it in, like that middle example, or there was wood cuttings that was inserted into the woodblock for the final pressing on the paper, which is why there's a very wide outline on the lower one. So to do that in the final style, I just really increased the halo outline, which is right here. And it also, I made sure it wasn't curved to kind of emulate the block of if it had been inserted, which is called a slot cutting specifically. And woodblock maps were made by carving into wood, and so the medium was limiting in terms of how finely curved the line work could be, and circles were often imperfect, and the way the ink was pressed onto the page caused a lot of splotching and inconsistent patterns, like some of the circles that I have on the page, like over here, there's some inconsistent pieces of ink. So in Adobe Illustrator, I created some line patterns that were inconsistent, like these edges are very inconsistent and weird to emulate the ink splotch patterns. And then I also created another one to emulate kind of a pen stroke that was inconsistent and kind of tapered off. And this took a little bit of work, because when you're creating any kind of pattern, you need to make sure the tessellation doesn't look really obvious. But it's fun to figure out when you finally do it. And so for that, I got the splotchy ink inconsistency line work in the country boundaries, as you can see on the left. And the inconsistent tapered lines kind of emulating an ink pen were in the roads. And as you can see, it already kind of looks like an old map from just these elements right here. But of course, whoever likes old maps also likes the symbology, so I had to do that. So I wanted to recreate buildings, because in a lot of woodblock styles, there's a lot of red buildings that show where cities are. And often they show different cities with the size changing based off of how many buildings there are. So you can see that in London, there's a large group of buildings, and in Paris, it's the same one. I only used 2 different symbologies that I created in Adobe Illustrator, and then in Frankfurt and Cardiff and other places, you can see I used a slightly smaller, less building space. And like I said, I made some map monsters too, and overall that really caused the entire style to look like an old style, even though it's online interactive map that you zoom in and out of, and it's all vector-based. So I pulled together my entire history of knowledge from my thesis to working online and coding to get that all together, which is really cool. And that's it. That's like, and this is just showing all the examples of symbology and vectors, etc. that I made.